In October 1347, 12 merchant ships dropped anchor in Sicily, in southern Italy. Not a single merchant disembarked, and no cargo was unloaded. Only corpses lay scattered about, along with a few people struggling for their final breaths. In the years that followed, the plague these ships carried would kill hundreds of millions. Panic spread to every corner of the continent, except for one small village that successfully resisted the greatest epidemic in history. But how? In the mid-6th century, within the Roman Empire, a strange disease emerged. It caused high fever, exhaustion, and large swellings all over the body. It swept through the land, taking tens of millions of lives before weakening simply because there was no one left to kill. It was the first time humanity had faced the horror of the plague. Centuries after the first outbreak, the pathogen never disappeared. It silently persisted in rodent populations across Asia, waiting for the right moment to return. In the early 13th century, as maritime trade routes exploded, the plague spread around the world via merchant ships. By the 1340s, it crossed from the Black Sea to Europe thanks to the 12 merchant ships arriving in Sicily. This marked the beginning of a dark era later known as the Black Death. Around 200 million people, nearly half of the world's population at the time, died. For centuries, the cause of the plague remained a mystery. Most Europeans believed it was divine punishment from God for humanity's sins. They sought forgiveness through prayer, or by whipping their bodies to beg for mercy from the Almighty. Others believed the cause was a poisonous air called miasma, and thus, staying away from it was the only safety. The wealthy carried scent bags filled with herbs and spices to ward off the poisonous air. The poor tried to survive with scraps of cloth or anything they could use to cover their nose and mouth. Doctors wore a terrifying costume, covered from head to toe, with a mask shaped like a bird's beak. Inside the beak was packed a mixture of over 55 herbs and ingredients such as green snake flesh and honey. This costume was designed by Charles de Lorme, a royal plague doctor in the 17th century. He believed the long beak would filter the air through aromatic substances before it entered the nose and lungs. However, none of these protective measures worked. The disease continued to spread everywhere. Not until the late 19th century did Dr. Alexander Yersin identify the cause, an extremely dangerous rod-shaped bacterium. It disabled the immune system's defenses by injecting toxins into protective cells such as macrophages. Once these defenders were wiped out, the bacteria multiplied rapidly. At first, people blamed rats for spreading the plague. But scientists now point to the fleas parasitizing rats as the true culprits. When a rat died, the fleas jumped to a new host carrying the infection, especially when rats lived in the heart of human communities. This is why humans became infected. Transmission also occurred through contact with corpses, infected blood, or inhaling droplets containing bacteria. Once infected, red swellings would quickly appear in the armpits or groin. From these lumps, blood and pus oozed out, accompanied by high fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and body-wide pain. Within 4 to 6 days, the patient would die, for there was no specific treatment. The Black Death spread terror across Europe for 4 centuries. Yet there were places the Reaper could not reach. In 1665, nearly 300 years after the Black Death had first ravaged Europe, England witnessed an unprecedented outbreak, with London as its epicenter. In just one summer, 15% of London's population perished. At night, the cry of "Bring out your dead" echoed throughout the city. Bodies were piled onto carts and dumped into massive burial pits. King Charles II fled London for Oxford. Anyone who could fled with their family. Only the poor remained, waiting for death. Relief measures proposed in Parliament were ignored. When deaths spiraled out of control, quarantine was enforced. The infected, along with their entire households, were locked behind sealed doors for 40 days. Red crosses were painted on doors, accompanied by the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Guards ensured no one escaped. Nurses supplied basic necessities, but because most were poor, they were confined in cramped, unsanitary spaces. Today, quarantine reminds us of COVID-19, but in the 17th century, quarantine meant mass death. After 40 days, almost no one survived. German neglect pushed the poor toward desperate death. Meanwhile, the exodus of nobles and ongoing trade spread the disease into the countryside. Disaster arrived at Ayham, a small village in central England, in an unexpected way. At the end of August 1665, a shipment of cloth from London arrived at a tailor's home. George Vicars, an apprentice, opened the package to inspect it. Seeing that some fabric was still damp and crawling with fleas, he hung the cloth over the fire to dry. The heat caused the fleas, carriers of the deadly disease, to leap onto Vicars. That night, red patches spread across his body, painful black swellings formed, accompanied by high fever and delirium. The strange illness terrified the villagers. 3 days after infection, Vicars breathed his last. Within a month, 5 more villagers died with identical symptoms. That autumn, entire families were wiped out. By December, the cold slowed the death toll slightly. But when the summer heat returned, the fleas became active again, and the plague resurged. The village sank into despair. There was no doctor or nurse. Their only hope was the village priest, William Mompesson. In the late 17th century, the church held great authority. Local priests were pillars of their communities. Mompesson had arrived in Ayham only 2 years earlier, replacing the beloved priest Thomas Stanley, who had been dismissed for resisting King Charles II's 1662 law mandating the use of the official prayer book. The villagers sided with Stanley and viewed Mompesson as an unwelcome intruder. But in crisis, they had no choice but to trust him. Even he didn't know how to stop the disease. Mompesson consulted Stanley, and together they devised a plan to save the village. On June 24, 1666, as church bells tolled for another death, the 2 priests stood before the villagers. Mompesson announced an unprecedented plan. The entire village would quarantine itself from the outside world. No one supported the idea. They understood that once they accepted isolation, if they didn't die from the disease, they could die from starvation. Fortunately, a solution arrived from a nearby landowner, the nobleman and philanthropist Sir George Savile. He agreed to supply food to the entire village during quarantine. Goods would be left in an abandoned well at the village boundary. Villagers would leave coins disinfected in vinegar, then take their food. With supplies secured, religious faith became the villagers' anchor. They believed that only by voluntarily isolating themselves could they prevent the plague from spreading. And when death came, they could return to God without carrying the sin of harming others. The quarantine began. Each family was responsible for its own hygiene and avoided all contact with neighbors. The dead were no longer carried to the churchyard, but buried in gardens or fields beside their homes. Sunday services were no longer held inside the church. Instead, people gathered in a nearby valley. During worship, families kept distant and did not speak. The first 2 months of quarantine seemed futile. In July, 56 people died. In August, the number rose to 78. Some, overwhelmed by fear, tried to flee. Others stayed, trusting their community. But faith alone could not decide who lived or died. Emmett Seidel, a 20-year-old woman, was engaged to Roland Torre from nearby Stony Middleton. She lived across from the tailor's house where Vicars had died. The plague soon took all her family. When quarantine began, Torre risked infection to visit her, but she refused to see him. To remain safe, they met in a ravine outside the village, where Sunday services were held. They sat apart, silently gazing at each other, never touching or speaking. Then one day, Emmett no longer came. Only after the plague ended did Torre learn his fiancée had died. Amid the darkness and grief, miracles still appeared. Some villagers never fell ill even as their entire families perished. Elizabeth Hancock was one such case. Her family lived on the village outskirts and initially escaped the disease. But in August 1666, black swellings appeared on her youngest son. 2 days later, her daughter fell ill. In less than a week, 6 children and her husband died. Because bodies could not be moved, Elizabeth had to bury each one herself. Despite daily contact with the sick and their bodies, she remained uninfected. From stories like hers, a glimmer of hope emerged. Marshall Howe's case was even stranger. Infected early, he miraculously survived. Rather than fear the plague, he became a gravedigger for households struck by death. If someone lived alone, he would enter their home, take valuables as payment, and bury them in the churchyard. He touched hundreds of infected corpses without protection, and yet the disease never returned. His recklessness partly came from grief. The plague had taken his wife and 2-year-old son. Priest Mompesson, who had held the village together through the nightmare, finally collapsed from exhaustion. On August 22, 1666, at the peak of the outbreak, he walked the hills with his wife. The next morning, she died. The shock shattered him, but strangely, the plague began to weaken thereafter. In the autumn of 1666, deaths slowed. On November 1, the last burial was recorded. When winter arrived, the plague in Am had ended. But what truly ended the nightmare? Stories of miraculous survival spread across England. And so did terrifying tales of people rising from the grave. Were any of them true, or were they myths? And how many Am villagers actually survived? According to a 2016 epidemiological study using parish records by Priest Stanley and Mompesson, combined with 1664 tax documents, Am's population was around 689. Of these, 257 died, and 432 survived. Thus, after more than a year living with the plague, Am's survival rate was 63%. Some believe that the squalor and density of cities increased infection and death. Rural settings, being less crowded, might limit the disease. Historian Justin Champion studied London's plague records, linking tax data to burial logs. Surprisingly, poverty, poor hygiene, and overcrowding showed no connection to death rates. Facing death, rich and poor were equally vulnerable. Am's isolation and open spaces could not explain its exceptional survival. So what did? Why did some fall ill while others did not? Studies of disease in large populations show no uniform outcomes. Not everyone is infected, and not everyone dies. Each pathogen follows its own rules. It was long assumed that differences came from nutrition, environment, or innate immunity. But science revealed another truth: our response to disease is largely determined by our genes. Scientist Stephen O'Brien proposed a bold hypothesis: Am's survivors may have been genetically protected. If true, such genes would pass through generations. DNA samples from descendants of Am villagers were collected to find proof. While waiting, O'Brien focused on a specific mutation, CCR5 delta 32, known to play a major role in immune resistance. If the gene did not appear in the samples, the hypothesis would collapse, but if it did, it could open new doors in medicine. To infect a body, pathogens need an entry point to cells. The plague bacteria exploited this system. It began by seizing control of white blood cells, the very defenders meant to destroy it. Hiding within them, the bacteria traveled to lymph nodes. then burst out and attacked the center of the immune system, leaving victims with almost no chance of survival. This hijacking made the plague a medical nightmare. O'Brien theorized that Delta 32 could lock the entry door, preventing bacteria from invading. After 3 weeks of testing at University College London, results arrived. Delta 32 was found in 14% of samples. But what did that mean? Was it a legacy of the plague? To find out, comparisons were made worldwide. Data from Africa, South America, and East Asia revealed no trace of the mutation. The prevalence in AM matched only regions in Europe heavily hit by the plague, and the Americas, whose populations descend largely from plague survivors. Delta 32 is essentially a genetic error. Normally, such mutations disappear unless they provide a powerful survival advantage. But if this gene could block plague, why did some people still fall ill and recover? O'Brien offered a convincing answer. Elizabeth Hancock never fell ill because she inherited 2 protective copies of the gene, one from each parent, creating an impenetrable defense. Others, like Margaret Blackwell, had only one. They still became infected, but Delta 32 slowed disease progression, giving the immune system time to overcome it. Thus, they survived. The discovery of Delta 32 not only explained AM's miraculous survival, but also opened pathways for modern medicine, especially against HIV. In 1996, scientists recognized that Delta 32 could lock the very receptor HIV uses to enter immune cells. The finding ignited a pharmaceutical race to replicate this natural mechanism in drugs. Today, some HIV patients have been fully cured through stem cell transplants from Delta 32 carriers. Though cases remain rare, they are enough to spark hope for humanity. Today, AM is a peaceful village in England. As the new century began, its population remained below 1,000, only slightly larger than before the plague. The village preserves the traditional character of the British countryside, cozy pubs, warm cafes, and an ancient church. Tourism flourishes. Visitors see green plaques on homes bearing the names of families who lost loved ones to the plague. They serve as eternal reminders that our lives today may have been purchased by the courage of generations past.